President Bush's chief scientific advisor has warned the world could become uninhabitable unless we cut emissions of greenhouse gases. Professor John Marburger told the BBC that man-made climate change is now unequivocal. It's by far the strongest warning so far from the White House on climate change. Well, our environment analyst, Roger Harrabin, has been talking to Professor Marburger, and he's with us now. Is this a change in the line of the White House? Because we seem to have had a bit of contradiction in the past year or so. President Bush saying he doesn't want to do anything too drastic, but accepting that maybe there is a problem that needs dealing with it. Does this take it a bit further? Well,
historically, the White House has given a couple of different messages on climate change. You hear one message from Dick Cheney, saying that, there's a debate we'll have to carry on. And then Professor Marburger, who advises the President on science, is saying here quite categorically that the science is now done and dusted, and we have to move on to cutting emissions.
All right, let's have a listen to what Professor Marburger has been telling you.
The climate is in fact sensitive to these CO2 emissions, and climate change will simply progress. The CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere, and there's no end point. It just gets hotter and hotter. So at some point, the planet becomes unlivable.
He wants action then, he wants action now. Does that include binding limits on greenhouse gas emissions, something that the White House has not been very keen on?
Well, that's very interesting. The White House is under enormous pressure at the moment from big business in particular to set binding limits, because they say they need to plan their long-term investment strategies. But the White House is resisting this. It's not President Bush's policy. He fears putting up energy prices. If you look at the International Energy Agency, they say that's exactly what needs to happen in the United States, maybe one of the measures to force people to be less profligate with energy. But Professor Marburger, quite interestingly, I asked him more, you can see the interview more on the web if you look, we'll have it up soon. He won't be committed on how much we have to cut and when. He says we know so little about the way the climate will change in the future that it's fruitless arguing about the numbers. We just have to start getting on with cutting emissions.
Now, he did sign up, didn't he, to the UN panel on climate change. He was involved in that, presumably. President Bush signed up to it. So should we be surprised that the Bush White House is now saying this?
I don't think we should be surprised that they're saying it. It's interesting to, there's two things really. One is a government can sign up to something. Lots of governments get forced through diplomatic pressure to sign up to things. It's another thing actually coming out and stating it quite so firmly, not just him, but also James Connaughton, the chief policy advisor, both saying today to the BBC it's unequivocal. But actually, this warning that the planet will become uninhabitable eventually unless we cut emissions, I mean, that really is very stark, and I've not heard anything remotely this strong from the White House before.
It comes, doesn't it, as President Bush is about to host this big summit on climate change. What Professor Marburger is saying, give us any clues as to where he might take that summit?
I don't really think it does. What it does do is set down a clear benchmark. In the States, just as in many countries, there's still a big debate going in the public as to whether or not scientists are convinced about climate change. Now, just now I've been reading a book by a long-term skeptic, just about to be published, saying actually climate change is purely natural. Now, while there is still this drip through the media of skepticism, there is very little pressure from the public for politicians to change. And that's what we're seeing in the United States at the moment, a kind of a stasis in which politics is locked with special interest groups, business interests, different political factions trying to make headway. But the headway in the US is very slow. And that feeds into the international process where other countries are looking at the US and saying, well, look, hey, you're the big emitter. If you're not cutting, then, how is that going to impact on our industries if our energy prices are higher? So I think there's still an awfully long way to go, although the pressure is undoubtedly building.